Hello, everyone. I know a fair number of people here, but I'm now working with Ray at the Open University's Applied Systems Thinking in Practice unit. I used to work at PwC in Cubes and Lybrand for 26 years. I've been in and around government and politics for a career lifetime. I was also chair of Demos and Relate, advisor to government ministers, and so on. And I should say my systems thinking or my systemic education started at Manchester Business School in 1972 with a lecture by Stafford Beer. Onward then to our talk here. So we've got this book that we've come out and, oh, sorry, that was, there we go, too much for a flick. What does the book say? So we're saying that systems thinking in practice provides the means to understand and fundamentally alter the systems that are governing our lives, which are essentially controlling what we do and preventing us doing what we need to do. And if we change our systems and then change our thinking and acting, this will rescue and protect the planet for us and for all other species. As we say, this may appear a big claim, systems thinking to the rescue. I don't think it is, and we suggest revisit the claim once. If you should manage it, so you read the book. So, and the other point to make there is that the problems that we're experiencing with the planet and the systemic causes and the systems underlying them are exactly the same systems that are causing the huge imbalances in power, wealth and well-being, and usually cause governments to be of a fairly mediocre standard. Right, there we go. So let's start with the biosphere then. So the biosphere, I should say incidentally, Steve, that a lot of your talk led, connected very well, or our talk connects very well with your talk. So I was really, really pleased. I don't know who organised it, but anyway, I think it's going to be good. So the biosphere is that part of the Earth's crust that supports life of all forms, including the virus in brackets. And the point is that it's the disruption to the biosphere that's causing the problems, the climate change, the climate emergency, the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and all the rest of it. Now, in 1992, George Bush, then president, in the run-up to the Rio summit, which was the first time global leaders were getting together to say, we better do something about this climate thing. His opening statement is, the American way of life is not up for negotiations, period. Which is fine, but good old George, what he didn't realize is that the biosphere doesn't negotiate. It doesn't listen to a morning's newspapers, the president's tweet, the news, the policies, laws, programs, all of this stuff that's going on down here has absolutely no impact on the biosphere whatsoever. It does what it does, depending on its internal dynamics, and of course what we throw at it. And we overvalue our agency at our peril. I mean, I'm not sure if I put this on the next slide, but in effect, humanity is in a power battle with nature. And, that's what's going on. And if you think about that, there's only one winner, and it's not us. And if we go on in the way in which we're going on, then it's pretty terminal. And the interesting people at this point say, oh yes, but the forecasts and is it really getting bad as fast as people have said, and East Anglia University. And actually, you go back to the forecasts when there was such a lot of fuss about them in the early 2000s, and indeed in the late 1900s, a lot of rubbishing going on. You look at those forecasts, and the bad news is that, yeah, they were wrong. They weren't pessimistic enough. And, you know, we've now got all of these warnings that have been sent to us, the Australian, Californian bushfires, famines. Even for people in Britain, if you visited mid Wales in early this year, January, February, I mean, it's absolutely awful. So what are we going to do? Well, I have to say that, you know, actually ignoring climate change, avoiding it, denying it, is actually very good for one's mental health. Because, you know, if you don't, I mean, this is looking pretty damn dire. So, you know, maybe that's what a lot of people will do, but the classic boiled frog analogy, which I don't think we need to repeat, where, you know, we all gradually fry and then we die, is another sort of option. We can wallow, and I think this to an extent is what we're doing. And, you know, I'm pointing at myself here. We wallow in our collective incapacity to tackle these emergencies. Or, to use a well-known phrase, do we take back control? Do we, and again, this comes back to the earlier conversations, the earlier discussions. Are we going to act positively? Are we going to gain agency? Are we going to say, right, collectively, all of us, shared meaning, we're going to get ahead of this. We're not going to catch up. And by the way, isn't it remarkable, this place we live? It's a unique place. I mean, do we know of any other place that's as wonderful to live as this in the entire universe? Why on earth would we go on making a disgusting mess of it? And in many respects, what we have to do is very, very simple. It's very, very simple. We have to stop polluting, and then we have to clean up our mess. It's just those two things. Takes a bit of time, I agree. Now, how? Well, I think we need a discipline, a collective discipline for us all, both in terms of our own lives, and remember, everyone has a two-way relationship with the biosphere. But these other people, like economists, economic theories and economists, I mean, who have treated, can you believe this? They've treated the environment as an externality. It doesn't count. Oh, by the way, I think we may have noticed that. What extraordinary. You could argue that they should all be up in you know, crimes against humanity in the future. Maybe some of them will. Politicians and political parties, you know, we can all blow Yabu sucks at them, and in some respects, yeah, fair enough, but they are trapped in these systems as well. Business and management, I mean, again, they get a bad press, but I know a lot of them, indeed, I know one of them who's just left the job as arguably, you know, one of the most evil polluters in the universe. He's a human being. He doesn't want to be doing that, and so on. So we need some sort of discipline to get us to shift. And that's this. So currently, if you look on the left-hand side here, Ray's come up with heuristic, which says, well, look, if you look at governance and you look at the way societies are organized, then this broadly is the pieces that you get. You've got the state, you've got judiciary law, you've got civil society, you've got the private sector, and we now put the media with the private sector. They used to be some sort of fourth estate that had a separate role, but we put them in there. And the most obvious one that's missing there, out of every governance model in the world, is the biosphere. which would then say, if we put it in the governance model, every time we do something, we have to judge that act against its relationship and impact on the biosphere. So, well, how would you do that? Well, in the book, we've come up with 26 principles for systemic governance, and I've pulled out the 7 here that we would suggest have to, some way or another, go into systemic governance. And part of that, and Ray will come on to that, is putting them into constitutions, absolutely hard and fast. And part of it is, if you like, what we do and how we behave and how we incorporate systems thinking with the biosphere as part of the system into our work. So you can see number 1 there, it's the central partner. Number 2 is in terms of sovereignty and where political power starts, which has to be, we suggest, with people who then delegate a defined measure of that power to the various government and other institutions. The commons, a great Austrian systemic thinker, and the ways in which the commons can be used. We often think of the commons as land, which of course it is, but the commons is also things like the internet and other shared resources. Number 22, I guess is obvious. Number 23, I mean, people have taught you, will have heard things like the circular economy. And essentially we're saying, look, if a company produces something, then its responsibility starts with the raw materials and where they've come from and the way they're mined and the way the people are treated that are mined and the impact that has on the biosphere. And it goes right through to, okay, you've produced a jumper, you don't just chuck it at someone and yeah, that's fine, that's the end of my job, I'm a retailer, thank you very much. You've got to have arrangements in place for what you're going to do with that jumper, including, of course, its microfibers. Company duty to inform so that we can all understand what it is that we are doing when we are using and consuming products. And then finally, this again is not about beating up the corporate sector. It's about saying, you know, we've got a massive transition to go here. We need to support people, particularly oil companies, coal companies, who are going to go through this transition. Over to you, Ray, I think.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Good evening, everyone, or I speak from Melbourne. Good morning from Melbourne. The theory of change that underpins what we're arguing in our book is that most of the change will have to come from within civil society, and that essentially means groups like us. And we don't have a blueprint, nor do we have a set of total prescriptions. So it's about how we collectively engage in thinking and acting in what we do and bring that to bear within inside new inventions of governance systems. No one doubts, or at least the rhetoric and the discourse is increasing about the importance and relevance of systems thinking and cybernetics thinking. So in some ways we're on the crest of a wave, but a wave has come and gone in the past and has crashed. We are both SCiO and the Open University, of course, at the centre of trying to develop capacity and capability in this field. And together I hope we can surf a growing wave of possibility that recovers people's systemic sensibilities, develops systems literacy, and takes literacy beyond just understanding to being able to act, to change and transform situations for the better. And I guess an argument in the book with regard to systemic sensibility is that we humans have tended to lose our systemic sensibilities because of the Western intellectual tradition and the way we operate, and that our at the core of a loss of systemic sensibility is the economic framing of us as rational human beings around the Homo economicus model. So we've lost some track of what it is to be human, except perhaps under COVID, where certain governments have taken a compassionate humanity view and ignored economy for periods of time. But in all sorts of discourses, the economy keeps rearing its head and the economists come back. So Ed, next slide, thanks. There's not much point inventing new governance systems if you do the governing in the same way as we've done before. And picking up from the previous speaker, we've got major metaphors of exploring how governing might be done, sailing the cybernetic metaphor from Kybernal, the Greek word for governing, steering, orchestra or jazz metaphors to do with social learning and the extent to which one is doing an organised performance or a improvised performance. And of course, then there's how we as a species co-evolve with the biosphere. We firmly reject the idea that what we are about is saving the earth. What we're actually doing is trying to enhance or sustain the quality of our co-evolution with the biosphere. The biosphere doesn't really give a stuff whether we survive or not. And so the question is, how do we act purposefully to maintain our relationship with the biosphere and our relationship with other species at the same time? One has to inhabit these new governance systems with new forms of practice, whether they be deliberative democracies, deliberative inquiries, or the work we've done on systemic inquiry and co-inquiry for exploring and beginning with uncertainty. We, in essence, are in a period new to human history with climate change, so we don't know what to do in the future, and the institutions we've invented are not necessarily relevant to the future that's unfolding. So we've got to begin a process of design, co-design, and inquiry. Ed is particularly keen on the idea that systems thinking is an alternative to party politics. I tend to come at this from the distinctions that systemic family therapists make between what they call a problem-determined system and a system-determined problem. Here in Australia, we've had a national cabinet that worked in the early days of COVID because they didn't know what to do. The premiers and the Prime Minister got together with experts and they started negotiating a system around a problem to do something about it. Over time, politics as usual has started to reassert itself, and so the existing system of politics is now reasserting itself, and they are no longer open to the uncertainty and vagaries of a virus operating in particular ways, except perhaps for one premier in Victoria, who's copping a lot of flack for the position, for the way he's operating. I thought I'd put in this slide to bring us up. This is not in the book particularly because COVID's only been with us for a short part of time. But if one thinks about the various phenomena going around, then you can interpret much of what is or isn't happening in governance terms in the arguments of our book, whether it's initial starting conditions, what happened in Wuhan, the lack of transparency, citizen involvement, rapid response. Did China set us off on a trajectory that has taken a long time to recover from? There's conjecture and fresh conjecture coming up about whether the virus was man-made, a technology, or not. So those are issues. On the other hand, countries that had experienced SARS in the past were much better and quicker off the mark I was amazed in February when I travelled from Australia to Britain about how organised the Singaporeans were at that stage and how completely hopeless they were at Heathrow. But of course, Singapore itself came undone because the viruses exposed the underbellies of every society. The underbelly of Singapore was the way it treated its guest workers and put them in essentially ghettos, which were very conducive to virus spread. Australia and some other countries were moved quickly to create a closed system model to overcome global connectivity. In some ways, we've still got that operating in Australia. I, as a citizen of Australia, have to get a permission to leave the country. So that's vastly different from what's operating in Britain. We've got contentious theory, herd immunity in Sweden versus the early stuff going on in Britain as well. We've had a lack of focus on breaking critical connectivity in nursing care homes. It is, to me, absolutely reprehensible that 43 nursing homes announced yesterday have now been reinfected again in Britain. The fact that you've got a government incapable of breaking that connectivity pattern says much about how hopeless a government system it is operating in Britain. Of course, cultural and political blind spots, and of course, inadequate feedback processes. Track and trace systems are essentially about monitoring and control systems and about making sure you don't have attenuated feedback processes. And they have worked well in some places, but terribly in other sorts of places. Okay, next slide. In the book, we give examples of successful governance experiments in different situations, in Frome around health, in Sheldon around water management. I thought I might just share this one that comes from Victoria, which has happened in the last couple of weeks. The track and tracing system from the centralised government not working effectively, not dealing with feedback nearly quickly enough. So the people of Colac, a small community 150 kilometres west of Melbourne, took things into their own hand and developed their own track and tracing system and their own codes of behaviour. And they've got totally on top of the virus in their community by taking control action into their own hand. So this is, to my mind, a classic exemplar of Ashby's law of how you get requisite variety in the right place in a governance system. And we've given other examples of that as well in the book. And one has to achieve this breakaway from command and control and create enabling environments for self-organisation and emergence to happen, as well as maintaining coordinating functions at higher levels, as in, say, Ostrom's polycentric governance models. Okay, next slide. Some of you will have seen this slide before. It's central to my work and the work we have, the modules we have at the Open University. We make the distinction between the two key adjectives that come from the word system: to be and act systemically, or to be and act systematically. Our contention is that we live in a world dominated by systematic cause and effect thinking. Command and control thinking is essentially systematic in its nature, and that what we who are interested in systemic relational thinking, which is ultimately what has to underpin the relationship of us as a species with the biosphere, is that we need a much bigger investment, ability to climb up from the systematic and inhabit the systemic in the institutions and organisations that we create. But it's not a simple dualism, an either or where one negates the other. We'll need both, but we need to change our priorities. Thanks, next slide. So if one thinks about our governance systems, well, we are a long way away from inhabiting a world where systemic governing is in place and functioning. We have structure-determined systems of governance which will have to be broken. But what we do see is an exciting array of experiments, many of them very positive, operating through civil society and civil initiatives, where the centralised command and control structures are failing and where people are taking initiatives of their own. So I think we collectively have got to foster that and build a meta discourse which creates an enabling environment for these initiatives to take root and to begin to be institutionalized. And in our model, the heuristic we've got, the whole notion of how we pursue questions of social purpose and how we engage communities in the reconstruction and reinvention of our constitutions is an important aspect. So next slide, please. Ed, do you want to talk about constitutions?
Yeah. I mean, they sit at the heart of what we need to do, and it's, yeah, they're very much part of the totality. I mean, in many countries, it's interesting coming back to Sweden. So the hairdresser that my wife Lindsay went to the other day, she's Swedish. She was fluent in talking about the Swedish constitution. There are two reasons that people in the UK aren't fluent about talking about the constitution. First of all, it barely exists. And it's now simply what the judges say a government can't do. But the second thing is that, I don't know why it is, but we simply don't see it. The classic thing in France, you know, public service is working. The response will be, yeah, but does its theory work? You can have conversations with all sorts of people around Europe about the power and importance of constitutions, and a lot of people understand, but it's less well understood here. They're fundamental. And people then turn around and say, it's the same with the American Constitution at present, oh, it can't be changed, it's fixed, it's set. But these things have always been changed. They've always been developed. You know, groups of concerned citizens have got together. I mean, just as actually Steve was talking earlier on, and they cohered locally and nationally. I think both on constitutions and the whole of the systems thinking, we need to mount an intellectual counter-revolution. If you read Nancy MacLean's book, Democracy in Chains, where she charts the way in which neoliberalism was created and spread, the people there, the intellectuals there, were very much about creating an intellectual counter-revolution. And now that's something we need to do. The other point that I'd make in this slide is that, you know, how do you get this political pressure? And always the classic one that I remember was in the 60s. Sorry, there's a helicopter going past, which may or may not be drowning out my talk. I think it's gone now. It's gone to rescue someone, probably. So in the 60s, there's the civil rights movement, there is Martin Luther King and all the rest of them trying to get stuff done. And Lyndon Johnson said to them, look, I need more political pressure on me, because if I have political pressure on me, then I can get something through Congress, the Civil Rights Act. So they mounted a vast demonstration. And that vast demonstration, yeah, it was very, very big, but that vast demonstration was sufficient to get those changes in place. So first of all, we need a new constitution. And secondly, we've got to talk about it and we've got to get pressure going to produce it. We talked earlier on about metaphors, and what is it that would shift our thinking and reframe our thinking through metaphors? And the thing that very much struck me in research for this book was what happened with the ozone layer. And yes, there were lots of regulations, there was lots of science, there was an alternative to CFCs, but one of the crucial points was the metaphors that were lifted in effect from Star Wars and Darth Vader and Star Trek and all of that stuff. So we have the ozone shield, this protective shield, and of course then we have the death rays. And the death rays were evidenced handily by a celebrity, Reagan, getting cancer, skin cancer on his nose. And that in many respects was, the killer metaphor, if you like, which helped to turn people's attention. It helped to build political pressure. And we were trying to think, well, what on earth is it that would make us see the biosphere, our life support system, in such a different way that we worship it, in effect, which is what we need to do. So we came up with this idea that the biosphere is God, and that we can place that God on a pedestal in the way in which gods have been placed on pedestals in the past, and shift the thinking, the rather stuck position that we're all in.
You want me to pick that up?
Yeah, please, Ray.
Okay. I said we didn't have a blueprint in our book, and the issue is that we humans lay down the path of our own living. We think and act out of our own traditions of understanding, and until such time as we change our root metaphors, our particular understandings, we can't join in conversations and dialogue around these issues. And we are historically stuck in a number of very disabling framings, which, as we argue in the book, needs active deframing. And I saw a comment somewhere in the chat function about you need the economy for things to happen. Well, an argument of the book is that the economy as constituted and as built into discourse is a particular set of metaphors and theories which are essentially inappropriate, inaccurate, dubious. And the economy is in essence just another way of being social. Now the issue is, how do we want to be social moving into the future? And no doubt there are things that involve transfer of resources and other things, but states can operate as they have in Australia by creating borrowings to create job seeker and a job keeper, maintain a reasonable level of support. And we were going well as a country when we were talking about a compassionate community that was privileging relationships amongst people, rather than a set of imperatives to drive the economy, as if the economy will react to the biology of a virus. These are mutually incompatible domains. And of course, you need horses for courses. Speaking with friends and colleagues in South Africa during the last week, South Africa followed a similar model to Australia in a very rigid shutdown of it and lockdown of its society. But South Africa has been plagued by state capture. It's got massive debts, and it can't afford, and it's got massive unemployment. And so a lockdown model just drove people into starvation. And so what operates in South Africa is not the same as what will operate in Australia because of the historical and cultural circumstances that are found. They've got to be designed and created for those circumstances. So only by taking responsibility for our own traditions of understanding and working together collaboratively are we going to get out of this. Next slide, Ed. This is the last slide. Again, this is the sort of meta contention of the book, if you like, and perhaps this is, this is a statement of purpose for SCiO if you want to take it on board. I mean, we live in a world that is our traditions of understanding that we perpetuate in the Western intellectual tradition is the systematic thinking and practice, command and control models, cause and effect, magic bullet thinking, power, hierarchy, all of these sorts of things. Whereas we've got to rebuild our systemic sensibility, understand that we as an evolutionary species of Homo sapiens, an ape, a tremendously social animal, ultimately live in relationship with other species and ourselves and the biosphere. And we have to embed that in our systems literacy and systems thinking and practice capability. Otherwise, and unless we can head off the systematic paradigm, then they don't give us much hope for a terribly viable future.
There we are.
There we are.
Do we have any chat on that, or were we chat free?
Chat doesn't.
You had quite a lot of chat, Ed.
It was substantial chat.
Some of it was deep. Can I ask you guys a question?
Sure.
So
that's what we're here for.
It's long seemed to me that, and I think this goes back to your Lyndon Johnson thing, actually, that politicians kind of recognize the problem. What they haven't got is a solution. And Lyndon Johnson was ready to move. He just needed the circumstances in which it was possible for him to move. So we need the circumstances creating for him in which a jump could be made. And I don't think it's the same kind of jump, or the same kind of hurdle, but it seems to me that policymakers, including politicians, are up against a similar problem in that it's not obvious. It's obvious what the problem is to some extent. It's not obvious what the hell they should do about it. And I'm kind of wondering your take on that. So we all recognize. I think we all recognize here that the model of unlimited growth in the economies is a problem. They don't have an alternative to that. Is it actually realistic to expect stuff to change until we have an alternative to that? Because they've got nowhere to go without that, I think.
Well,
I might head off, Ed, and then if that's okay.
Yeah.
Can I just we in different societies in the past, we've invented governance systems from scratch. I mean, if you take Australia and the US, New Zealand, Canada, etc., often ignoring Indigenous people terribly, except perhaps in New Zealand where Maori were recognised through treaty. We came together, invented governance systems, often took the British model of government, I must say, but Australia has a written constitution, Britain doesn't. One of the biggest hurdles to overcome in the first instance is to get people to be able to think and talk about governance as if it were a system. So if you take that heuristic model of merely just that simple model of the state, the law, civil society, the media, and the private sector, and if you drill down into each of those as we have done in our book, then you begin to build a way of thinking about what is actually going on. And at the moment, most journalists can't even begin to do that. There's no discourse, no analysis. So it would enable you to say things about the Chinese Communist Party and how the lack of independence of the judiciary is a major constraint that we all feel about our relationship with China. In fact, we Australians, I mean, I myself have decided professionally I'm not going back to China because I just don't trust the rule of law in China and how it's evoked. In Britain, the Tory party is playing with the powers of the judiciary. It's trying to circumscribe judicial review, which is one of the few ways citizens have of holding the executive to account. It's trying to diminish the role of the parliament in relation to the power of the executive. The Cummings example is a classic exemplar of how that is. And then you've got stuff happening in the private sector, as well as media concentration. And one of the most terrible ones in the last week or two is the actual discussion that they might turn the Extinction Rebellion into a certified terrorist organisation. I mean, these are appalling things that are playing with the whole system of governance in the UK, yet we don't have a way of discussing and talking about it, and there are very few journalists capable of doing that. Ed, do you want to pick up, say?
Yeah. It's interesting because in Davos, you know, the World Economic Forum, I was talking to Simon Corkin. This was a year or 2 years ago now when it was meeting, and you know they've been the sort of visible exposition of well, the prevailing economic system, the fact that, you know, everything's working, it's all so wonderful, isn't it brilliant, it produces all this stuff, you know, poverty levels go down and so on and so forth. And then it was very evident that all of the stuff that they were producing and turning out had changed quite substantially. And, you know, suddenly they're sort of getting green, you know, good grief. Suddenly they're being environmental. Suddenly they're concerned about the situation of workers in mines in deepest Africa and so on. And I said to Simon, he spent a lot of time there over the years. I said, well, what's going on? And you know, have they got God, as it were? And he said, no, they're running scared. And if you get into government at a central level, on the one hand, the politicians are doing what politicians do, but on the other hand, they're not stupid. They're really not stupid. And the more you see of this stuff, the more you know that we're in a fix. The world is in a fix, and it's got to get out of the fix. And you do see in different countries of the world, I mean, China in some respects, you know, on the one hand, its performance in relation to all sorts of things is pretty dreadful, but in other respects, they damn well know they're in a fix as much as anyone else, and we have to stop polluting. You know, this is not a choice. This is not something that we can have a vote on. You know, we have to stop disturbing the biosphere. It's quite simple. So they see that now. Where politics comes in is when we start saying that, you know, more than just, I mean, Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion and the school strikes, I thought, produced a major shift in atmosphere and attitude. And I mean, in some respects, it was a shame that COVID-19 came along. However, COVID-19 came along and said, well, actually, we can change all of these institutions. They're only human inventions. We can do all sorts of different things. Nothing is set in stone if we really need to. The second thing that's happened is that there's a new orthodoxy. Debt is a good thing. And you'll see this playing out. So this is national debt. Now, up to now, you know, debt has, the neoliberal orthodox folks have generally sought to use debt as a means of control and order. Now it's turned on its head. Debt, you know, it's great, it's good. I mean, interest rates are virtually zero. In fact, in many respects, they're negative. So let's have loads more debt. So in the sense of, well, we do know what to do. There's any number of books. The latest one by Jonathan Porritt, Hope in Hell. That's a long list. An earlier one, There Is No Planet B. You know, there's a whole raft of things that we could be getting on with. And it will either go one of two ways, I guess. One is, you know, it will be that we'll just get boiled because we'll just sit here. And unfortunately, the burning platform won't get hot enough. But on the other hand, you know, events, I don't know how it's going to shift the discourse in Australia, but the bushfires there in Australia, which affected a huge number of the population, and what's going on in the States, I can't see how people aren't going to react. The problem currently, well, I suppose if you take Europe generally, you know, we haven't had the big horrors, but, you know, rest assured, the big horrors are coming our way. It's only a matter of time. And it's like in the discourse between ourselves and between the people in the shops and the pubs and so on and so forth. It's you know, are we going to get on with this? You know, are we collectively? Because if we collectively are going to get on with this, then that's the start of political pressure.
Okay, before we sort of get into any more discussions, I'm just conscious we are nearing the official 8:30 close. We can carry on conversations for another half an hour after this. So if, Benjamin, would you like to just do your final checkout?
Yeah, I've already shared the link in the chat, but before anybody leaves, it'd be very much appreciated. 3 people have always been